Chapter 11. In the thick of them. Sakes alive! Foul play! Whatever do you mean? The spoon lay unregarded, slowly but surely slipping down the side of the bowl toward complete oblivion, in the creamy batter. Speak up, Rosanna. You're getting me all nervy. Rosanna sat down on the edge of the kitchen table, her back turned against the streaming window pane. Gingerly, with a spoon and a fork which she took from the drawer of the table, she rescued the drowned spoon. But Hester gave her no thank you. In fact, she remained almost unaware of the service rendered, and merely stood waiting with extreme impatience for Rosanna's explanation. "Well, it's this way," Rosanna began. "It's just as we all of us agree. Mr. Kirk isn't the sort to go back on his word. If he said he'd do a thing, he'd do it." "You absolutely think so, don't you, Hester?" Hester certainly had thought so until he failed to come. That blue-eyed, much-tanned sailor radiated integrity, courage, and spirit. He would live up to any word he gave, even a casual word. Hester implied all that in her silent nod, and Rosanna continued, "Then it's plain as day that something has kept him by force from coming, something or someone. It was pretty important, his getting here, for he had a plan which we both almost counted on, to give the Dryad back her memory. You see, he knows all about who she is and who Pat is. They belong to each other, that girl and boy. I can tell you that much now, Hester. I think when I need your advice and help." But before he tried his scheme with the Dryad or saw Pat again, Pat was perfectly horrid to Mr. Kirk this morning. Hester, he was going to Wingate to see Mr. Titus again. He'd already been there before he wandered into our lane this morning. It's just as Claire and Rob claim, Hester. Wingate is a mysterious place, a rather dreadful place just now. What I believe is that something has happened to Mr. Kirk there on this second call. He has met with foul play. The Hindu, do you suppose the Hindu's in it? Hester asked. Rosanna nodded forlornly. Mr. Titus, or the Hindu, perhaps both of them. It doesn't much matter. Hester gasped. "And all the time, Rosanna," she blurted self-accusingly, "while I thought you was sort of on edge just because your pride was hurt on account of your new admirers not showing up. This was what was worrying you. I might have known there was something serious for you to fidget." Rosanna laughed, but not merrily. "When anybody understands and admires a person as much as I do Mr. James Kirk," she told Hester, "I don't think ordinary everyday pride gets into it very much. I'd never be bothered like that, not by him, Hester." Sakes alive! Hester had said it again, her strongest expletive. "Well, when things begin to move with you, Faze, they move fast. That's all I've got to say. You're seriously interested in a young man, in this young man. At last, Rosanna." Rosanna did not hesitate over her reply. "I shouldn't wonder if I am," she responded. "But that's not the point now, is it? What are we going to do That's what I want to know. What can we do?" Hester was prompt. She exclaimed, "We've got to save him. That's what we've got to do. Rosanna Fay, at the risk of our own lives. If need be, that is, if you feel like you say you do. Though I must say it's the suddenest thing. I'll do just what you tell me to, Rosanna. Just anything. I'll go over to Wingate. I'll tell those impolite Tituses they can't keep a young man against his will. I'll—" She was beating up her batter now, with a vengeance, standing tall and Amazon-like, a valiant figure in the dusky kitchen. Rosanna was extraordinarily cheered up. It was everything to have such a strong personality, as Hester with one. "I'll tell you what, Hester," she said. "It's no use doing anything. I'm afraid not until we're dead certain something serious has happened. After all, he's a big, strong man, and he has been in plenty of adventures before now, which needed daring and brains to get him through. Even if they are holding him at Wingate, and he can't get word to us, he's probably already putting through some plan for escape. I haven't anything to go ahead on, you see, not anything we could make people believe without some proof, but it's worth everything knowing that you're with me if the time does come when we can act. The great thing now is to behave as usual in front of the children. No use getting them any more excited than they already are." But the game Rosanna and Hester agreed to play before the children was a difficult one, and the weather did not help any. The rain, instead of lulling at intervals, as most rains do, had spells of growing fiercer, if that was possible. The lightning and thunder passed off in the course of 20 minutes or so, but they, from the first in the storm, had been merely a trivial accompaniment to the violence of the rain itself. "It's more like a cloud burst than anything else I ever see," Hester ejaculated several times during the course of the evening. "The roads will all be rivers, and I only hope the dam at the reservoir holds. It's the worst storm in years." It had grown chilly, and Rob lighted a fire in the Franklin stove, in the parlor, and in the baby Franklin too, in the Dryad's room upstairs. When supper was ready, in spite of all Hester's ringing of the bell, which was kept at hand in the kitchen for the purpose of calling strayed Fays to meals, Pat did not appear. This was almost too much. Rosanna insisted against Hester's advice on getting into her raincoat and battling her way up to the barn through the elements. Rob and Claire followed as soon as they learned where she had gone, practically defying Hester to hold them back. Rosanna was standing in the middle of the loft room, on the verge of wringing her hands in the good old tragedy manner, when Rob and Claire stormed up the ladder. She did not bother to exclaim over their having exposed themselves so needlessly, but asked in a weary voice, "Where does the fellow keep the matches? It's terribly dark. Here's the lamp." When Rob, after a methodical fumbling in the gloom, finally hit upon the matchbox, they lighted the oil lamp and looked about the deserted room with some interest. It was evident at once that Pat had not done what they feared, taken himself off with the intention of not returning, or, if he had gone for good, he had left behind the things he had brought in his bundle, and that did not seem a likely thing to do. Folded neatly on the foot of his bed lay a pair of blue silk pajamas. Rosanna picked them up. Yes, they were sky blue silk pajamas, very heavy, luxuriant silk, and made, she saw at a glance, by hand. Strange wear for a hired boy. Carefully she returned them to their original folds, and their place on the foot of the bed. Next she went to the chest of drawers they had spared him from Lark's Nest, and pulled out the top drawer. More folded garments came to view, another pajama set, and underclothes. These things too were silk, of marvelous quality and workmanship. The underwear was cream-colored. Rob snorted. What real boy would consent to wear cream-colored silk union suits, and what of a hired boy who wore them? But the object that interested Claire beyond this princely gear was the book Pat had brought up out of the cellar at Wing Gate. She drew it out from under his pillow, where she had caught a glimpse of its corner. Yes, as he had told them, it was a copy of the Iliad in the original Greek. But though the purple leather binding was shabby and worn now, it had once been made to somebody's order, expensively and beautifully. It was tooled with a design that fascinated Claire, sea waves and a shoreline, with a tree at the outer edge, dropping fruit, and out on the water a Homeric ship. Claire opened the book and found, on the fly-leaf, written in a bold but small hand, the ink faded to violet, this, Patrick Donovan, his book. Impulsively she thrust the book and the name under Rob's nose. What were they to make of it? Pat had claimed the book for his own, when Rob had questioned him about it in the woods last night. If he had never told them, as he had told them this morning, in no uncertain way, that Pat Donovan was not really his name, they could think now that he had spoken the truth in the woods, when first questioned about the book. But if Pat Donovan was not his name, then whose name was it? And had Pat really found this beautifully printed and bound classic thrown away on an ash heap at Wing Gate? Rosanna looked at it a minute, when they showed it to her, but finally frowned and shook her head. She couldn't puzzle it out. Apparently, in spite of all that knowledge in her possession, which she was keeping to herself. "Let's go in to supper," she said. "Hester's slaved to make it for us. We can at least pretend to eat it." Claire felt decidedly low in her mind as they struggled back through rain and dark to the lighted kitchen door, and the smell of popovers and cheese souffle. But Claire's melancholy, if she had only known it, was not to be compared to Rosanna's. For Claire, up to this point, was afraid of no more than a bad wetting for Pat, while Rosanna feared, she hardly dared to think, what for Pat's disowned uncle, James Kirk. All the long evening, Rosanna hovered like a moth at the windows, only she was beating her wings toward the dark, and the moth beats toward the light. Her hope that Mr. Kirk would come whistling through the downpour, safe, and with a tale to tell, would not down. He must, with all his experience of danger, find a way out of even such serious difficulties as Rosanna feared for him. But Claire's hovering was done mostly in the kitchen, at the rain-driven back door. Toward 9 o'clock, she said threateningly to Hester, who was reading her Bible by the lamp on the scoured deal table, "If Pat's light doesn't show soon, I'll go over to Wingate through the woods, storm or no storm, and demand whether they've seen him. I'm beginning to get frightened, Hester. Do you suppose he went into the cellar again on his walk this afternoon and got nabbed by the Hindu?" "He ain't a Hindu, he's a Mussulman," Hester surprisingly replied, putting out a finger to a word to keep her place, and looking sympathetically at her friend over the top of her reading glasses. "A what? Now how do you know that? You're joking." "No, it's no joke. None of this is any joke. I'm thinking, but I shouldn't have let that out about the Hindu not being a Hindu. It's something Rosanna just happened to mention when we was discussing things out here before supper. The sailor told her. I don't know exactly the difference, do you? So, he is real. He isn't a dream of ours. There is a tall, dark man who goes around all in white and wears a turban, and Miss Ford has never seen him, and for some reason he isn't supposed to be seen. And he isn't a Hindu, he's a Mussulman. Well, we're beginning to get on. How much more do you know, Hester?" "Only that, but I've begun to put 2 and 2 together, and make out more. It's all right to tell you the rest of it, since it's my own conjecture, and nothing Rosanna's told me. That creature you saw, Claire, last night, when you was up in the apple tree, well, that must have been the Mussulman. First, he seemed so outlandishly tall like a tree, because he was wearing his turban. When he got out into the field and turned short, it was because he'd all of a sudden unwound the thing and took it off. Then he took a dark cape he was all the time carrying over his arm, and done himself up in that, so he turned black. Ain't that a good enough explanation of all you saw last night?" "I'll say it is," Claire cried, admiration lighting up her face and making her eyes shine so brightly that Hester's heart took fire and warmth from the fond gaze. "It takes you to sort things out, Hester. Yes, it must have been the Hindu, the Mussulman, and it must be just as you said, the whole performance. But what was he doing, spying on Lark's Nest?" "Why, he was spying on Pat, of course. That's why he climbed the ladder and looked into the loft." "Oh, Hester, Hester, do you suppose he's got him now?" Claire's delight in Hester's solution of that one mystery had ended suddenly in a fresh realization of possible evil for Pat. "No, he hasn't got him now, or leastwise, I don't think so." Hester, whose chair was facing the window, replied in a calm, pleasant voice, "For there's a light up there this minute." So Hester had been the first to catch the blob Pat's just lighted lamp made through the sheets of rain flung between the barn and the house. Claire screamed her surprise and joy, and Rob came dashing into the kitchen to find out what was the matter. Claire was not the screaming type of girl, and Rob knew that something pretty important must have happened. "No, siree, I'm going," he exclaimed authoritatively, yanking Hester's cape from Claire's shoulders. The garment she had dragged from its nail in the back hall the instant after her scream. He picked up his own raincoat, which had been spread near the stove to dry after its recent adventuring. "You're not to go up to the barn again," he commanded his sister. "I'll bring him down for supper." Well, it didn't matter. Pat was safe. Rob could be the first to welcome him, if he insisted on it. Claire regained her usual quiet. Hester went into the pantry to get out the ingredients for cocoa, and Claire followed her to help. "We'll feed him up," Hester muttered, as she doled out sugar from the sugar bin and reached down the cocoa. "He'll be hungry and cold, I shouldn't wonder, but I'd sure like to know what's the difference between a Hindu and a Mussulman." "Do you know, Claire?" Claire was glad now to answer the question, which in her excitement she had ignored before. "Well, I guess so. Something anyway. Most people in India are Hindus in their religion, but lots of Mohammedans live there too and call themselves Muslims. The Indian rulers and fighters are almost all Muslims. They follow the prophet of one God. The Hindus have hundreds of gods. Horrible idols mostly. Muslims are more like us. They believe in God." "Ha!" Hester ejaculated, cutting the bread, while Claire got butter from the refrigerator at the end of the pantry. "All that seems a pretty far cry just the same, from us here at Four Corners, on Granny Duffield's farm, don't it?" Lark's Nest was still called by the neighbors Granny Duffield's farm, and sometimes Hester herself forgot, and so named it. Mussulmans and Hindus and all those foreign affairs, and we mixed up in 'em. What beats me is Miss Ford never catching on. She ain't seen hide nor hair of this Mussulman, that's sure, or all the place would have been buzzin' with it before now. How'd he get here, invisible so sort of? What's he doin'? Playin' on pianos, leavin' diamonds on tables, peekin' out of windows, and snoopin' around our own place here. It all beats me. And him almost a Christian, believin' in one God." "It beats me too," Claire agreed, "but it's pretty exciting, not to say thrilling. Don't you think, Hester? I tell you, we are right in the thick of genuine mysteries." Chapter 12. To the Pit. Pat, as they had known he must be, was drenched to the skin, but they were not prepared for the utter fatigue and desolateness of his manner and face. He was too weary and too worried about something or other to be hungry, although he admitted that he had not tasted food since breakfast. Rosanna heard the confusion of his arrival with Rob from the barn, and came down from the Dryad's room, where she had just finished tucking their guest up for the night. Her manner to Pat rather surprised the others, for there was a sharpness in it, almost a shrewishness. that was totally foreign to their usual Rosanna. "Now, Pat," she commanded, "this time you're to say where you've been and what you've been doing. You can't worry a whole household like this, half out of its wits, and give no explanations." Pat stood by the door, rivers running from his shoulders, his haggard young eyes looking back at Rosanna with dogged self-containment. "I've been walking," was his short but courteous answer. "I explained to Hester that I would be away at dinner time." "You've been walking?" Rosanna scrutinized him. His legs to his knees were soaked in mud. "Yes, one sees that. But where? In and out of cellar windows? Fess up, Pat. I've got to know." Pat saw there was no help for it when Rosanna spoke and looked like that. "I have been down in the cellar over there again. And more than that, I've been all over the house. I acted like a thief, sneaking behind people's backs, hiding under tables and beds, upstairs and down, and nobody saw me." "Ha!" Rosanna appeared strangely delighted with this account of their hired boy's Sunday behavior. "That's fine. Then you may have seen Mr. Kirk. Tell me quickly, did you?" "Mr. Kirk?" Pat appeared honestly surprised by the question. "The gentleman you introduced me to in the lane this morning. Called himself my uncle." Yes, of course. Did you see him at Wing Gate?" Pat shook his head. Rosanna's eyes were boring holes in him. Her hands were tight clasped. Rob and Claire could not understand her agitation and her impatience, but Hester understood it well enough, and to some extent shared it. "On your honor, your word of honor, you were in Wing Gate sneaking around, watching the family, and you have no reason to suspect that Mr. Kirk is there?" Pat gave his word of honor in such a way that nobody doubted it. "All right," Rosanna said. Then, in a woeful, flat tone, "Now, Pat, for heaven's sake, let Rob give you some dry things, and take this cocoa with you into the parlor, where you've got to change by the fire there. It's the warmest place in the house now." Rob told Claire afterward that the minute they were shut into the parlor, Pat went over to the mantel and, putting his head down on his arms, burst into sobs. Rob was nonplussed, and waiting, helpless and embarrassed, for the boy to get control of himself. It lasted only an instant, and then Pat looked up and said, brushing his eyes with the back of his hand, "I was looking for something at Wing Gate that I didn't find. Something precious. Tomorrow I've got to give up my job on account of not finding it." "You don't really need a hired boy anyway. I'm not much good, but I can't remember ever crying before, not since I was a little fellow." If Rob had repeated these remarks to Claire that night, and given her an account of their hired boy's weeping, she would have gone to bed with an anxious and unhappy mind. But in the excitement of getting Pat fed and back to the barn dry, and the rest of them then retiring with great caution not to disturb the Dryad, no opportunity occurred for confidences between the chums, and the next morning was so full of its own adventures and alarms that Rob actually forgot Pat's decision to throw up his job and his unexplained wretchedness of the evening. All night the rain drilled on the shingle roof of Lark's Nest and gushed in the lead gutters. But the little house was not the nesting place of peace and snugness that one passing it in the wild night might have fancied. There was much turning of pillows, tossing of blankets, many troubled dreams, and at least one or two nightmares, for the mysteries and anxieties in the air, together with the Dryad's continued loss of memory, made a general atmosphere not conducive to peaceful slumbers. Rosanna, waking with a start from her first sleep, tucked her hair behind her ears, turned on her pillow, and stared toward the black windows. She felt that the sky was driving misery, not rain, onto the attic roof. I wish I'd told Rob and Claire the whole story, she thought. When he didn't come, I should have. Rob sometimes has good ideas, and he might have advised doing something, not just coming supinely to bed. I don't believe that Rob or Claire or Hester either, for that matter, would go to sleep if a friend of theirs was in danger. We could have taken Peg away and got down to the inn somehow, in spite of the weather. If he wasn't there, and nobody knew where he was, Mr. Ford might have gone with us to Wing Gate. Then, though I don't believe he would, because it is such a strange story, I'd have to tell him first. Mr. Ford is really better than Claire and Rob think, but still, this would probably have been a little beyond his powers. Then she sat up suddenly, so intent on her worries that she did not notice the damp, cold air on her bare arms and neck. Heavens! The thing to have done was for us, Rob and me, to have got Pegaway up the road to Wing Gate, or walked if he stuck in the mud, and told those people that we know all about their game, and could make it pretty uncomfortable for them if they didn't give Mr. Kirk up. Oh, what a good-for-nothing female I am! How could I be so soft as just come to bed? I'll get up and go now. She struck a match, and looked at the wrist watch under her pillow. It was 1:45. No, I can't. I'm not sure he's in danger. I only feel it. I can't go making an idiot of myself for something that may exist only in my imagination. She rolled over on her face, and lay, her eyes buried in the pillow, her hands at her ears to shut out the noise of the rain. But it was no good. Finally she lighted the lamp on the table by her bed, and read from one of Mr. Kirk's books there until a little after 4. By 6 it will be all right to go to the inn, she told herself. Somebody'll be down in the kitchen then, and if Mr. Kirk's missing, they'll know. Consoled by the thought that in so short a time now the night would be over, and she could act, Rosanna blew out the lamp, turned on her side, and plunged headlong, it seemed, into a bottomless well of sleep. So, of course, she overslept, as anybody who has ever so misused a night could have promised her she would. The sun was well up when she woke to the good smell of sizzling bacon, water running into the tub in the bathroom across the hall, and Claire's voice mingling with the splashing water as she caroled, "Row, men, row, though the winds blow, 'gainst the current we must go. Yonder birches on the shore, we must reach them." Rosanna tossed her buttercup hair from her eyes, jumped out of bed, and ran to the window. The sky seemed higher than yesterday. When, subtly and unnoticed, it had been preparing itself for the storm. White clouds were banked up along the horizon to the west, as though they were the besoms that had swept the world and heavens clear again. Perhaps they had swept through Rosanna's mind too, for now the miseries of the night appeared unreasonable and strangely unreal. Things could not be so bad as she had thought them. There must be some simpler explanation of Mr. Kirke's failure to appear. He might be in the lane this minute, coming to explain. She drowned Claire's song with music of her own, standing before her mirror and twirling up her hair in preparation for her turn at the tub. She sang more emphatically than artistically. One Friday morn, when we set sail, not very far from land, we there did spy a fair, pretty maid, with a comb and a glass in her hand, with a comb and a glass in her hand. While the raging seas did roar, and the stormy winds did blow, while we jolly sailor boys were up into the tops, and the land-lubbers lying down below, low, low, and the land-lubbers lying down below. That silenced Claire at any rate, and made her hurry and give somebody else a chance for a bath. Lark's Nest was awake now. Who could doubt it? The minute Claire was dressed, she ran in to ask the Dryad how she did. She did very well, although her memory had not been given back to her in sleep, an event that they all hoped for, and kept expecting, and was already dressed to go downstairs and breakfast with them. Under ordinary circumstances, beginning to lead a normal life now would have been the most healthful thing the Dryad could do. But who, in spite of the morning's sunshine and the fresh hope in the atmosphere, could call conditions normal at Lark's Nest? No, the Dryad must wait, just a little longer. Mr. Kirke would be found, or would come of himself this morning, and Pat be got in, and the scheme which Mr. Kirke counted on for restoring the Dryad to herself would be tried. Until then, Rosanna said the Dryad must stay in the guest room. Claire wondered a bit at the Dryad's unquestioning submissiveness. Was the girl used to being thwarted and coerced? It seemed so. Breakfast was an incident that sped past, hardly noticed by the partakers. So who remembers what Hester provided on that fateful morning? Napkins were left unfolded. Sweaters were yanked from hooks, for it was cool after the night's long rain. Pegaway was jerked awake in his stall. Hester and Pat were waved a hopeful and merry good-bye, and the three Fays were off for the inn and any knowledge that might be gleaned there of Mr. Kirke. But early as they got to the inn, someone was ahead of them, inquiring for the author sailor. Mr. Janus's horse stood, champing at the door, held by the one small boy the place afforded, and at the desk, just inside, Mr. Janus himself, in riding breeches and swinging his crop, was inquiring in a voice, every word of which filled the reception hall. "Mr. James Kirke is stopping here, isn't he? Can I find him in the dining room?" It was Rob who heard this, for he had left the girls in Pegaway, while he came in to make inquiries in a quiet manner that would not unnecessarily stir the landlord's curiosity. Now he was grateful that the necessity of inquiry had been taken from him, and he pretended to be examining a map of the state hanging near the desk on the wall, and to have come in merely for that purpose. The landlord, behind his desk, hesitated an instant over his reply, and his answer, when it came, sounded a little strained and unwilling. He said, "Yes, Mr. James Kirk is staying here all right, or we thought so. He slept here Saturday night, and his suitcase is up there now, because I sent up to see a minute ago. The last anybody has seen of him at the inn, though, was Sunday morning, when Augustus, the bellboy, says he saw him going out before breakfast. So naturally we have begun to wonder. A friend of yours, Mr. Janus?" "Well, no, not exactly, but a friend of friends. The fact is, my wife wanted me to give him an invitation to lunch today. He's quite a celebrity. Were you aware?" "Oh, yes, of course. I know who James Kirk is, if this is the James Kirk, and he said he was the James Kirk when I asked him point blank as he was registering. But this disappearance act of his, what do you make of it? My wife believes—" Rob did not linger to hear what the innkeeper's wife believed, because he had no reason to think it would be either wise or helpful. She was a sister of Mr. Ford's, and Rob had his prejudices. With assumed callousness, he turned to the door, and then bolted across the road to where Pegaway was parked in front of the post office. Rosanna was aghast at the news he brought, for although it corresponded well enough with her fears of last night, it did not go at all with the mood of the morning. For one frightened instant she dropped her head in her hands and sat as though stunned, but it was over almost before it was observed by her surprised brother and sister. Her head came up, and the courage and determination in her face outshone the tears brimming her eyes. "Listen, Rob," she said. "If we go to Mr. Ford now with the story Mr. Kirk told me Sunday morning, I don't believe he'd do anything or be any help. At least, he'd be slower than molasses in getting started, having to listen to his sister's version of the disappearance, and smoking his pipe over it before he even commenced to think. It would be afternoon or tomorrow before he started anything. I guess it's up to us." She halted and looked squarely into Rob's eyes. "Rob," she asked, her voice low and cool, "if you were this Mr. Titus, and were living at Wingate, and had killed a man, and wanted to hide his body, what would you do with it?" Rob did not exclaim or ask any questions before he gave his answer. This was no time for personal emotions or delay, not if things were as crucial as Rosanna seemed to believe. He replied instantly, "I'd take the body over to the pit and just toss it in. It might never be found under those bushes, and anyway it'd give a fellow time to make his getaway." Claire, alone in the back seat, watching her brothers' and sisters' white faces, felt as though her heart were opening and shutting like an accordion. "All right," Rosanna said, sliding along so that Rob could take the wheel. "The pit was my idea too. We'll go there before we try the house anyway." And as Pegaway woke to action with a willing roar, Rosanna turned and gave Claire a look. "Claire," she commanded, "you pray as hard as you can that Pegaway doesn't stick in the mud on that back road. Time may mean everything. I've got to watch for holes ahead. Rob's got to drive. But don't you stop praying till we get there." Chapter 13. Disappearance. The pit was a hole in Tanglewood, a rather deep hole, as the name which the Fays had given it on discovering it years before indicates. Claire and Rob had made it their own and never minded the trouble it took to reach it, away out toward the edge of Tanglewood, far from Lark's Nest. Some time it must have been dug by man for some other purpose, but that purpose was long past and forgotten. The years had sent sweet ferns to blot out the man-made scars, and whole clouds of bluebells to keep the sweet ferns company. If you climbed down very carefully through a fringe of thorny bushes, and broke no bones doing it, you reached enchanted safety, where you found 2 flat rocks, which served very well for seats, facing each other across clouds of bluebells. And if you were Claire and Rob, you felt that now you were well out of the world, up in a sky of your own. For all that, you had come down, dangerously down, to get there. But now this morning the pit had taken on a different aspect to their minds. If dark deeds were forward at Wingate, such dark deeds as Rosanna had hinted, well, the pit might very well enter into them. The quickest way to get there, if Claire's prayers were answered, and they could keep out of mud holes, was the back road, which left 4 corners at Mill Bridge, and wandered off, as though for its own pleasure rather than the public's convenience, into the country. It was a wretched road, from an autoist point of view, amounting in places to not much more than a track through woods and meadows, but Pegaway kept hopefully at it. Only once was there real danger of sticking and stalling, and then Rob maneuvered things so well that they pulled breathlessly out of the difficulty and sailed on. In another minute they turned a corner, and there was Tanglewood's own high gray wall, and not an eighth of a mile beyond that point, where a horse-chestnut tree dropped its branches over the edge, lay their pit. Rob let the girls out, and then backed, zigzagging, into the elder bushes on the high side of the road. A passer-by, and there was not likely to be one on such a day, on such a road, would not be aware of a car parked there at all. Next, for the wall, Rob turned his back to it, bracing himself, and more like a bird than a human girl. Claire mounted to his shoulder and flitted over. Rosanna was not such an adept, but what her practice lacked, her will supplied, and she accomplished the ascent of the wall with no more damage done than a slight bruise to Rob's shoulder, and one badly scraped elbow of her own. But Rob was not conscious of the bruise, nor Rosanna of the scrape, and none of them gave a thought, or half a thought, to their sloshy, muddied feet and torn clothes as they plowed their way through the undergrowth between the wall and the pit. At the end of their journey they halted and peered down through the bushes which hung themselves along the edges of the pit, as though on purpose to screen the skyland below. From the top here you would never guess about the bluebells and the sweet ferns. The three had come through the outer courts. That is what Claire and Rob were in the habit of considering the difficult approach to their bit of secret sky, not speaking, and as quietly as possible. But now Rob said, "No need of you girls going down. It'll be soaking. If there's anything, I'll shout up." They hushed, for even now there was something, a sound from the depths down there. They could just see the tops of some very tall ferns, moving more than the breeze would move them. And they could just hear a groan or a moan, but there was no voice, no words. Rob called down, but softly, not to attract undue attention from the rest of the woods. "Say, is that you, Kirk? Are you there?" The fern tops did not cease their tossing, and the strange, strangled sounds grew louder before they died. But no voice answered. Was it man or beast? What to do? If it was the sailor, why didn't he answer? Claire whispered, "It must be some animal. The Tituses may have set a trap. They wouldn't want even woodchucks to trespass." But Rob had started down. "You girls stay there," he directed. Rosanna, in her haste to follow, very nearly stepped on his fingers, which were clutching the sides of the bank, as he let himself down. "Say, look out, up there." "I said to stay where you are," Rob shouted, forgetting the wisdom of silence. But Rosanna paid no attention. She merely waited until Rob had removed his fingers, and then went down herself, aping his methods of descent, and succeeding very well. "Stay where you are, Claire." She spoke in a tone which, though low, was almost unearthly in its clarity and authority. "Mind me, or you'll be sorry." So Claire could only lean there, at the edge, lying flat, face down, watching the bushes after her brother and sister had disappeared into them, and following their invisible path by sounds and the movement of leaves. Then suddenly, for one brief instant, there was utter stillness. Claire's heart stopped. She felt to listen. Her fingers dug into the earth at the pit's edge. Then, oh, relief, Rob's voice muffled, but articulate. "Jehoshaphat, it's Kirk, all right." Claire could not understand the protracted silence which followed that exclamation. If Mr. Kirk was dead down there, it could not be he who had groaned and thrashed about in the ferns. And yet, if he was alive, why didn't he speak now? And where was Rosanna? What was she doing? Rob's voice again. "My hand's so wet I can't get a grip on the blade." "You try, Rosanna." They were struggling to get Rob's jackknife opened. Claire realized. Yes, that was it. She knew very well that the blade had a mean way of sticking unless you got your nails under it just so, and if your hands were wet. Rosanna's voice. "There, oh heavens, careful, Rob, let me." Rob's voice. "No, you're trembling. I won't cut him, see." And then, oh glory, Claire stood up, but she did not shout her praise. She danced it on the pit's edge in utter silence. Mr. Kirk's voice, husky and weak, but with eagerness and a kind of gay life in it, too, had asked, "Pat and the Dryad, are they with you still? Are they safe?" So he was alive. Then Claire fell to her knees and stretched down her hands. They were bringing him up, or helping him, rather, and Claire might now tug and pull and be good for something besides rejoicing and dancing. In another minute they had all got away from the pit's edge, out of the bushes, and Mr. Kirk was leaning against a tree. But such a Mr. Kirk! His tweed suit was more visibly mud than tweed. His brown cheeks were stained and streaked with mud, and there was an ugly wide red mark across his jaw. That was where the gag which Rob's jackknife had cut had been drawn, but in spite of the sailor's truly ghastly appearance, his eyes were the same keen, happy blue eyes, and his voice had regained its natural tones again. "It's home for us," Rob exclaimed. When along with Claire, he realized that Mr. Kirk was gaining strength by the minute. "It's Hester now, and food and fire. How long were you in the pit?" "Don't know. What's it now?" "Monday morning, 7 minutes past 9. "Well, I've been gagged and trussed up in that hole almost 24 hours then. Gad, it feels like years." By the time he was stowed into the car between Rosanna and Claire in the back seat, Mr. Kirk had begun to shake with a chill. Between his chattering teeth he said, "Don't expect any sense from me now, girls. When I've got warm, if I ever do, I'll explain why I didn't come back yesterday. Just now, all I care about is Pat and the Dryad. You're sure they're here and still safe at Lark's Nest? That's great news." Rosanna took her sweater and Rob's and Claire's and wrapped them around him. "They're safe absolutely," she assured him firmly. "We don't want to know anything. We won't bother you. We'll be home in 10 minutes. But she was wrong. They were home in 6 minutes, because Rob knew how to get good service out of Pegway in an emergency like this, and nobody present was timid of a little speed. Hester met them at the front door, holding the screen wide and her mouth shut. It's only fools who go asking questions when it's plain at a glance that what's needed is hot water, brandy, and warm blankets. But before Mr. Kirk would let them start him up the stairs, he took a firm hold of the newel post and demanded to be reassured once again as to Pat and the Dryad. Were they safe? Were they in the house? Hester assured him that Pat was in the kitchen, this minute, washing the potatoes, which were intended for dinner, and the Dryad was reading one of Mr. Kirk's own books on the chaise lounge in the spare room. Now would he be a sensible man and get along up? Rob was already up in the bathroom, running hot water into the tub, and Rosanna had flown to the medicine closet for the brandy. Hester herself would start some strong coffee. "But lock the doors first," Mr. Kirk commanded, between his chattering teeth. all the doors in the house. Mr. Titus won't stop at anything, it seems. And Hester, keep Pat from going out. He's to stay in till I've got on something dry and can talk to him. You'll see to it." Certainly Hester would see to it, if only he'd get along up. "It's a good thing I've kept the stove going since 6, she added to herself, "so there's plenty of hot water. It's just luck." The hot water ran sizzling into the tub. 4 pairs of feet rushed about getting blankets, warmed coffee made, and Rob's room ready for an occupant. But most of the activity was wasted, for, his bath accomplished, Mr. Kirk pushed aside the bathrobe Rob offered and demanded clothes. Wasn't there something in the house they could manage for him? Bed was the last place on earth he would consent to go, and that was flat. Hester standing just outside the door, with a mustard plaster, ready for application, in a steaming basin in her hand, heard this and scowled. Was the man mad? But whether he was mad or not, he got his way. Underclothes and an old golf suit of Mr. Fay's were raked from moth-proof storage in the attic, and Rob's newest linen shirt was proved an adequate fit, except for the top button, which was tight, but that was nothing. Mr. Kirk turned the soft collar in at the neck, and somehow that only added a touch of poetry and boheme to his healthy sailor make-up. And then, standing dressed and eager in the hot sunshine, which poured through the open windows at the end of the upstairs hall, he said briskly, "The Dryad. She's there in her room." "Oh, yes." Claire was the one to answer. "I looked in when I was going for the brandy glass. Wonder what she's made of all the commotion." I didn't stop to explain anything to her. "Well, now's the time for our experiment." Then Mr. Kirk said, "Bring up Pat." His voice had an excited, exhilarated note. "I'll just make sure she's ready for callers," Rosanna put in quickly. "Are you sure the chill's all gone, Mr. Kirk? Are you ready for things really?" Claire, quicker than Rosanna, who was waiting for reassurances, had run to the Dryad's room, and now she returned into the hall, her expression rather queer. Rob and Rosanna and Mr. Kirk looked at her inquiringly, and Rob asked, "What's up?" Claire came toward them. "She's not there," she said, but in a tone of hardly believing it herself. The 3, intent on seeing for themselves, rushed past her to the spare room. It was empty of the Dryad, and nothing but one of Mr. Kirk's books, open, face down, on a chair, was left to remind them that she had ever been there. She was gone, vanished, in her gauzy, unearthly garments, and little silver slippers. Even her faint perfume had faded, but Claire had seen her there when she went downstairs for the brandy glass, not much more than 10 minutes ago. She was positive. "Well, she's just gone downstairs then." Rosanna spoke with calm conviction. "Run along and find her, Claire." But Claire stood, looking dazed. She didn't go downstairs. "I haven't moved from the window in the hall here since I came back with the glass. I'd have seen her if she'd come out at all." Rosanna laughed, but a trifle uneasily. "She must have gone down while you were in the dining room getting the glass, don't you see?" But Claire denied it. "Hester met me at the foot of the stairs," she said. "She was bringing up the glass." No, the Dryad never went down the stairs, never came out of her room from the time I looked in and saw her there. She couldn't have, without my noticing. Mr. Kirk's brow was dark. Look for her, he commanded. Find her quickly. I'll go through the rooms up here. The rest of you make sure she's not down. Claire must be wrong. They found the front door still bolted on the inside, as Claire had fixed it in accordance with Mr. Kirk's wish when they came in. The little side door leading out from the dining room into Granny's flower garden was bolted too, on the inside. Hester had attended to that. Claire reached the kitchen first. All was peace here, and no Dryad. Pat was shelling peas absent-mindedly, and Hester was busy with knife and fork carving up the Sunday chicken for soup. Has the Dryad been here? Claire cried. Pat looked at her, uncomprehending, but Hester assured her that nobody had been in the kitchen but themselves. Then she's flown. Just as she came, Claire almost sang. She's got back to her tree and the woods. Oh, Hester, it's wonderful. What I want to inquire about, Pat began, is why I am held a prisoner. Hester has locked the kitchen door, and she is keeping me. That's my doing, Mr. Kirk said in his deep, alive tones at Claire's shoulder. One of you is safe anyway. Praise be for that. Come along into the parlor, Pat and Hester. We've got to talk quickly and then act. Pat's sister has been kidnapped. Is that it? Is that what has happened to her? Pat was on his feet by the kitchen table. The high kitchen chair, which he had been using, knocked halfway across the floor, his face gone deathly white, his gray eyes black. How do you know? Rosanna's in the parlor. Come along. Mr. Kirk had turned away from the kitchen door, and the three piled out after him. Rosanna was standing between the windows, an expression of deep consternation on her features. Rob came bounding down from a second search of the upstairs and attic. Hester, Claire, and Pat drew toward Rosanna, as toward the light, as toward comfort. Pat and Claire had fast hold of hands, although they were hardly aware of it. Mr. Kirk turned to Pat. I'll tell you now why I insist on being your uncle, Pat Donovan, he said swiftly and with determination and energy in his whole voice, and bearing in spite of the slight trembling which had come with a return of chill. No time for breaking it gently or thinking of your feelings now. We've got to borrow Pegaway and get to Wing Gate, you and I, and do something about your sister's disappearance. I don't myself see how it happened. Not if Claire's right, and she was in sight of the door all the time, as she says she was. It's a dark mystery, but I'd swear to this. Titus did it. He got his hands on her some way. Sakes alive, Claire heard Hester ejaculate under her breath. Maybe it was the Mussulman got her, and not Mr. Titus. Sounds more likely. Mr. Kirk looked in Hester's direction, but absently, thoughts flying swiftly after each other across his face. He turned to Pat forcefully. Here it is, in a nutshell, he began. That man, Titus. But Rosanna interrupted. Good heavens, she exclaimed. The Dryad's coming up the walk. Which of them got to the front door first, unbolted it, and opened the screen? Which of them drew the Dryad into the hall doesn't matter, for nobody remembers now. It was all done too quickly, and with too much high excitement. It was only when they had the Dryad safe in the parlor that they began really to see with their eyes and think with their brains. And now she stood in their midst, a little breathless, but with new color in her face, immaculate and lovely, her silver-gray draperies just moving delicately in the breeze from the open windows. And then they became aware of two surprising objects which had been brought into the room by the Dryad. Incongruous objects, both of them, in the hands of such an unearthly, woods-like vision. In her right hand she was holding something hard and glittering, something that caught the light in 1,000 facets, and sprayed rainbows and sparkles into the air. Claire and Rob knew it at once. It was the diamond bracelet they had seen lying weeks ago on the little table by the window in the drawing-room at Wingate. But the object dangling from the fingers of the Dryad's other hand was even more to be amazed at. It was a bright, absolutely efficient-looking revolver. Chapter 14. Ali, son of Yusuf. Mr. Kirk made a quick movement forward, and without a "by your leave," took the weapon away from her. When he had assured himself that it was loaded, he whistled and placed it carefully behind the clock on the mantel over the Franklin stove. The bracelet the Dryad herself put down casually on the arm of the sofa near at hand. And now that these things were done, Claire noticed Pat. He was standing near the Dryad, a light in his face that fairly made Claire blink. At this instant he cried, "Dora!" and came toward her. She shrank instinctively back from the precipitant movement, and her eyes widened, taking him in. Then very softly and naturally, in her gentle, clear voice, she exclaimed, "Norman, hello!" Complete silence in the parlor now. It was wonderfully stirring to be present at the Dryad's coming to herself, but Mr. Kirk had meant to prepare Pat for his sister's loss of memory, and this haphazard meeting caused him anxiety. So much might depend on Pat's coolness. He had followed him up, and now put a restraining hand on the boy's shoulder. But Pat shook it off. "Dora, I've been desperate about you," he cried, oblivious of the others, and looking at the Dryad with as much reproach as delight, it seemed. But her behavior puzzled him, naturally. She stepped back 2 steps, her eyes on his face, and merely murmured again, softly, "Hello, Norman." Then she looked around at the others, all staring, and all so deathly silent. "Where were you?" "You weren't at Wingate," Pat declared. "How did you get here?" "Does Uncle Lawrence know you're here?" "Does he know I'm here?" "Oh, Dora, I was desperate, I tell you." The Dryad scarcely listened to him. She said to Rosanna and Claire and Rob, "Now I know who I am. That's who I am. Why, how could I ever forget?" She turned back to Pat. "Hello," she repeated, for the 3rd time, and suddenly they were in each other's arms, and the next instant the Dryad was weeping convulsively, still tight in Pat's embrace. So that was all right. Her name spoken in a loved voice, or the sight of Pat, or both together. had broken the evil charm. She was freed. Hester and Rob and Claire exchanged glances. They had lost a Dryad, but they were glad for the girl's sake, and for Pat's. Brother and sister were on the sofa now. Pat's arm around her shoulder, her right hand fast in his left. She was looking all around the little parlor very curiously. "This is where Rob gave me lemonade," she said, and then Rosanna and Claire came in. "You've all been very good to me here. It's strange. How can such a thing happen to forget like that?" But Pat, of course, understood nothing, so they all began explaining to him at once, and finally, piece by piece, he arranged it for himself into a whole. So all the time he had been making his excursions to Wayne Gate, hoping to snatch a stolen minute with his sister, she had been at Lark's Nest, upstairs in the guest room. Mr. Kirk allowed them just time to impart the information, and Pat barely time to absorb it, before he insisted on attention to those things that interested and were vital to himself. "Tell us," he commanded the Dryad, "how you vanished like that, and where you got the revolver. I have to know at once." But in spite of his abrupt manners, he was looking at the Dryad with an expression on his face which puzzled Claire. There was some sadness in it, and more diffidence, she thought. The Dryad, for her part, hardly bothered to look at Mr. Kirk, for to her he was a stranger, and a person who had had no part in the fantastic period when she had forgotten who she was. She answered his questions, but it was at the Fays and Pat that she looked, and to them she spoke. This was her story. She was being obedient to Rosanna about staying in the guest room, but it was hard because she was so very lonely. The Fays had gone off somewhere in the car, and Hester was busy in the kitchen. She tried to read a book which Rosanna had given her, the last thing before going away, but it didn't help much. She stopped at every paragraph to try to remember who she was, and to wonder what was to become of her. Then the family had returned, but with such a commotion. They were running about all over the house. Nobody bothered about her at all, and this made her lonelier than she had been in their absence. When Claire at last appeared at the door, the Dryad was utterly grateful to see a face again, and to know that one person at least remembered her existence. She opened her mouth to say so, when lo, Claire whisked out of sight again. The Dryad's heart sank, and it did not help any that Claire had taken pains to shut her door tight before leaving it. That was really too much. Utter loneliness at last, and for the first time at Lark's Nest, took possession of her. Why were they keeping her a prisoner here in one room? What was going on in the house? Anyway, with all that running about, and opening and shutting of doors? She threw down her book and went over to the window, and down on the flagged path leading up to the front door. From the lane, her eyes met the eyes of a new stranger, a man. It seemed almost as if he had been waiting there for her to come to the window. She knew now that that man was Uncle Lawrence, Mr. Titus, but she didn't know it then. She did not recognize him at all. He was just a stranger, as she had said. Here the Dryad paused, in almost amused wonder. "I can't understand my not knowing," she exclaimed. Imagine not knowing Uncle Lawrence. It's too simply weird, Pat. But here, with an impatient gesture, Mr. Kirk pushed her on with her narration. The stranger had seemed friendly. He called her by a name, Isadora. So she realized that here at last was somebody that knew her. It was the first ray of light she had had since that instant in the woods when she found herself staring at the bright orange mushroom, without being able to imagine who on earth she was. The man swept off his hat as he spoke her name and hurried across the grass to stand under her window. He spoke to her in a low tone and with a sort of cautious looking about. He said, "So you are here too. Come along down. Just put up that screen and step to the trellis. I'll catch you at the bottom." He knew her. He had a name for her. Besides, he spoke with authority. All that, taken together, was more than enough for the bewildered girl. Without an instant's hesitation, she pushed up the screen, stepped out backward, feeling for her footing on the trellis, built for crimson ramblers, and worked her way down. It was a little dizzying, but not bad, and she was helped at the bottom. In fact, her elbow was seized, and she was rather yanked along the path and into the lane at a breathless speed. They crossed the state road, and almost ran up the wood road that struck off there into the trees, and kept on until they came to a big car, which was standing almost lost in the underbrush. And now suddenly the stranger dropped his mask of goodwill. He commanded the Dryad not to speak, glared at her a second, as though daring her to disobey, and then whipped a notebook from his vest pocket, balancing the edge of this little book against the wheel of the car, and leaning forward from his place in the road, he began writing with a fountain pen. When his note was done, he tore out the page, folded it up tight, and pushed it into her hand. Next he drew a revolver and a bracelet from a pocket in the side of the car, thrust them both at her, and said, "Now, Isadora, sweet little traitor, get along back to your friends with these 3 things, the note, the diamonds, and the revolver. I'm done with you." And while she stood, dazed and stupid, looking at the 3 objects which had been so angrily forced on her, he jumped into his car, backed it out to the road, and was gone. So she returned to Lark's Nest, and at Lark's Nest she found Pat, and at last remembered herself. And here's the note. She had tucked it down into the front of her dress, but now she produced it, and was holding it out toward the room in general. It was addressed to James Kirk, but Mr. Kirk did not try their patience by reading it, even once through to himself. He began the instant he had it unfolded, aloud. "Hello, Kirk. Both of us are adventurers, and at this writing adrift in the same boat. But now that we've come to a showdown, I have a way out for us both. You take the girl and give me the boy. The bracelet, if cashed in, will fix you for life. Ali, son of Yusuf, won't fuss about the jewels, for he thinks she ran away with them and drowned herself. This is straight. He'll give you no trouble if you keep her hidden a few days, and then lose yourself. I'll get Pat his kingship and keep it for him. And I agree to divvy with you on revenue every year as long as the good luck holds. Meet me back at Lark's Nest, other side of the wall, at sharp noon. Ali's shut in his room mourning the death of Isadora, so have Pat with you, and we'll arrange the business speedily. The revolver shows you I mean fair play. Bring it. There's everything in this for you if you've got the nerve for it. Yours for a good life, L. Titus. P.S. I never meant to leave you so long in that hole. I was only giving myself time to think a bit. Besides, old Ali was always around watching, and I never could get back to you. Mr. Kirk refolded the note he had read to the breathless listeners, and pushed it under the diamond bracelet on the sofa arm. He looked amazingly angry, Claire thought, but she, like the others, kept silent, waiting for what he might say. After a short pause he laughed, a bitter laugh. "Look here," he said, including them all. Everybody but Rosanna must be slightly puzzled. Sit down. What's the use of standing? May I? He looked at Rosanna. Oh, of course, do. I am so sorry. We should have remembered you were half dead, Rosanna exclaimed. He sank into the chair. Rob pushed at him, but he did not relax. All of them sat down, except Hester. She remained standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped in her calico apron. I'll begin at the beginning, Mr. Kirk said, and just tell you everything. It's too bad, Pat and Margaret. That's your name, Margaret, not Isadora. But I'm the only relative you've got in the world. I'm afraid, and you might as well make up your minds to it right off. Your fake Uncle Lawrence is done for and out of it. I shall tell him so when we meet at noon, t'other side of the wall. It's after 11 now. Well, that's all right. Time for my story. Here goes. Do sit down, Hester. You bewilder me, towering there. Hester only tightened her arms in their cradle and blurted, as though she hated being disagreeable, but was forced to it. Mr. Kirk, this looks pretty queer to me. Him calling you an adventurer. If it's true, and that's what you are, and you'll excuse my saying so, you'll have to get right away out of this house. After all, I'm the only grown-up person here, in spite of Rosanna's being so dependable and all, and I don't take my responsibilities light. These children are— Mr. Kirk sprang up, crossed to Hester, led her to a chair, and sat her down, as though she were a big doll, all to her amazement. See here, Hester, he exclaimed, I'm no adventurer. These children are as dear to me every bit as they are to you. Yes, it's true, even in this short time. We'll take our responsibility together, shall we? Hester had no argument to meet James Kirk's rather wistful smile and firm speech, so he returned to his chair, got out a pipe, and taking Rosanna's smile for consent, stuffed in the tobacco, struck a match, inhaled gratefully for a minute, and then, holding the bowl in one slightly tremulous hand, returned his attention to his audience. I'll begin with your angle of things, Pat and Margaret, he said, instead of letting you Tell it, I'll tell it. If I'm wrong at any point, you can correct. The girl and boy, sitting close to each other on the sofa, remained silent, but their faces were strained. They were skeptical about the sailor's claim and aloof. "Well, here goes." Mr. Kirk started off in a rather tentative manner, looking now and then toward Pat and Margaret, as though expecting correction or surprise. But soon seeing that he was to get neither, he hurried on with more assurance. "You have had a unique sort of life, you two. Your uncle has made himself responsible for you, and lately your aunt, for he has married in the past year. Titus is all the family you have ever possessed, but it's been a funny relationship. He is cold, indifferent, and often away. He is uniformly courteous, however, and outwardly kind, and he has, from your earliest memories, supplied you with beautiful clothes, food for Epicureans, and extensive travel. But there has never been a home, for your lives have been a continual progress from country to country. You have lived in 100 houses, and now and then, but more rarely, in palatial hotels. But in spite of this, your education has not been neglected. Far from it. A tutor is always with you, except during actual travel. On ships and trains, you never catch sight of him, but once arrived at your destination, you find him ahead of you, ready to take up the chapters and the exercises where you left them off. This man's name is Ali, son of Yusuf. You have realized that he is a mystery and often discussed it with each other, but out of familiarity you have accepted it as we do accept those mysteries that are with us always. Wherever you are, he has a room for himself in some isolated part of the house, or if it is a hotel, he occupies an entire suite of his own next to yours. He cooks his food himself, but you have never seen him eat or known the times of his meals. How this Ali, son of Yusuf, spends the hours when he is not actually instructing you, you have not fathomed. You have never seen him wandering in any part of the house beyond his own apartments, and you have never met him on the street. In fact, except as your tutor, his is an invincible entity. Uncle Lawrence frequently changes his servants, except the Japanese cook, who as long as you can remember has been a fixture. When you were little, you each had a nurse, but you never became attached to these nurses, because there was never time for that, before their places were taken by new, strange nurses. In Japan, there were Japanese nurses. In Spain, Spanish nurses, and so on endlessly. Except for these passing nurses, you have had contact with almost nobody but each other. There have never been playmates of your own ages. You have never in your lives walked unaccompanied on the street, or walked alone in the country. You read and speak French, German, Spanish, and Greek, at least superficially, but English and Arabic are your native tongues. You speak and think in these two languages as naturally as you breathe. That is because they are the language which Ali knows perfectly. Pat has been drilled in history and economics within an inch of his life, but Margaret's knowledge of these subjects has all come by way of overhearing, for it has never been anybody's intention that she should be educated, except possibly in languages. and all the years of your childhood and youth you have had only each other to love. Your uncle and your new aunt have meant almost nothing to your hearts. Possibly, though, I doubt it, you have some affection for Ali, but he has done nothing for you, that I can see, but drill book learning into Pat, and restrain you both from any natural human inclinations toward freedom. Your last domicile was a villa outside of Rome, where Pat was worked at his lessons interminably, and Margaret was taught how to make lace by an Italian peasant woman who came in daily. In the middle of June you were uprooted with more suddenness even than usual, and transplanted to America and Wingate. And that brings us up to date, or almost. I must leave off at the time where Pat, 3 days ago, took it into his head to run away and get a job. But I am right so far. Pat, Margaret. Mr. Kirk had come to a halt and was looking at the two on the sofa appealingly. Pat nodded, but Margaret, the Dryad, looked at her brother reproachfully. "No, he isn't right about Ali," she protested. "Ali is fine, and he is our true friend." "Yes?" Mr. Kirk showed some surprise, "and it was he who presented you with that very handsome diamond bracelet the day you found him ahead of you at Wingate, waiting as usual. Well, it is good to hear that in your empty young lives you feel you have one friend. And now, Pat, go on where I left off. You ran away." But before Pat had even begun to open his mouth, Hester sprang to her feet and rushed to peep through a crack at the edge of a window. "Drapery," she whispered. "I thought I heard voices. And it's the Janices comin' up the lane. Land sakes, couldn't they have stayed away just this one of all mornings?" There followed hushed pandemonium. The side door, somebody hissed, "Hester can say we are out." And almost at once Hester could truthfully say that there was nobody but herself. In Lark's Nest, for all the others had slid and glided and crept down the hall to the dining room and out the side door, there into Granny's little walled-in flower garden, before Violet and Bill had so much as set foot on the flagged walk. Outside, under the dining room windows, on the strip of lawn bordering Granny's garden, the sailor sank down in the sunshine and leaned his back against the sun-heated bricks of the cellar wall. "Oh, this is fine," he ejaculated, when he had got his legs stuck satisfactorily out in front of him and was settled. And all at once new color began to back up the tan in his face, and joy of life renewed itself in his blue eyes. The hot morning sunshine was better than mustard plasters, warmed blankets, and brandy, all taken together. Claire and Rob exchanged an understanding look. "We might have known," their eyes told each other, "that when Hester and the rest of us failed to take decent care of this stiff-necked sailor, Granny would step in and manage it, for the sunshine in this sweet walled-in enclosure was all Granny's sunshine, nobody else's." Chapter 15. The Runaways Explain. Although Mr. Kirk liked and needed the direct heat of the sun after his exposure of last night in the pit. The other members of this skulking and concealed party looked for shade. They arranged themselves quite comfortably near enough to Mr. Kirk to hear and be heard in the shadow of a spreading yellow rose bush. The garden wall effectually concealed them from the unwelcome visitors, even if those visitors should take it into their heads to come wandering around the house. But they were hardly likely to do that. Probably they had merely dropped in to get Rosanna and Rob to go to the inn with them for lunch, and finding them not available, would fly on to look up some other companions. Now all that remained was for Hester to join the group in the garden, so that Pat might give the story which Mr. Kirk wanted. Why didn't she come? There had been more than time, certainly, to say her speech to the Janices, and she would be the last person in the world to hold them talking, most of all at this exciting moment in Lark's Nest history. Rosanna was uneasy. This deceit and hiding from friends went much against the grain of her clear, straightforward mind. Her face was a little set. Claire couldn't help noticing, but she had to acquiesce. This morning, of all mornings, as Hester had implied, was not one to be receiving callers. When Hester at last appeared, she had her darning bag on one arm and was wearing her sunbonnet. She said briefly, "Getting rid of 'em was easy as pie, and I just stopped in passin' to pop the 'tatoes in the oven and the soup onto the fire. Move over a bit, Mr. Kirk. I like the sun too." And when she had seated herself beside Mr. Kirk, her back like his against the bricks, her sunbonnet jerked far forward, throwing her whole face into shadow, she took from her bag a pair of Claire's stockings and started darning. Claire would not meet Rosanna's eyes, which she knew must at this point be turned to herself reprovingly. If Hester wanted to spoil people and insisted on taking their jobs right out of their mouths, was it any of Rosanna's business? "Well, Pat, it's the most noon. Tell me, quick, why you ran away, and then I'll tell you quick how I know that I'm your uncle." "I ran away because I was angry," Pat began, perfectly ready to tell his story. "You say that Ali repressed any tendency toward freedom in us, and you are right. He did try to do that, always, but he didn't always succeed. Dora and I both liked Wingate better than any other place we'd ever seen the minute we came. Mr. Kirk interrupted, tapping his pipe nonchalantly against the cellar wall, but speaking with a certain bulldog determination for all that. He said, "Pat, from this instant, I am going to request you to call your sister by the name she was baptized with. That name is Margaret. I shan't repress your tendencies toward freedom in any other matter, but in this one particular I shall be insistent. I see red every time I hear my niece, Margaret, spoken of as Isadora or Dora. Now forge ahead, remembering that." Pat had stiffened, and Claire noticed suddenly, with something like a thrill down her spine, that Pat looked like Mr. Kirk. There was the same strong set to his chin, From then on, during his brief story, Pat spoke of Margaret as my sister. My sister and I, he continued, have never been in North America before. It excited us and made us different inside, freer. We said that to each other, anyway, and the woods all around Wing Gate were a wonderland to us. We had come all the way from Boston in a limousine, and Uncle Lawrence had the windows down until we began to get quite near, but he had them put up and the curtains pulled just before we got to a place called Four Corners, so nobody saw us arriving, and that was what he wanted. My uncle had warned us that in America we were to be kept in even stricter seclusion than ordinary. Nobody must know that there were young people at Wingate at all. This was because there might be spies about, and while he believed he had put them off and left Italy without their knowledge, still he could not be sure, he said. But spies, Claire gasped, not able to contain her wonder. Whatever? Mr. Kirk shook his head at her warningly. He wanted Pat to go on without interruption, no matter what strange things he said. Yes, spies. Uncle is always afraid of spies. But my sister and I thought that since the woods were really so wild, and nobody came into them because of the wall, we might explore. So we found a way of getting out of the house and staying out for hours, when all the time we were supposed to be up in our apartment in the 3rd story. We never had such fun. One day we got as far as the wall, here by your garden. We heard voices and considerable laughter, and I climbed into a tree and looked over to find out what was going on. You were all there in the vegetable garden, even Hester, working away and having the best time I had ever seen anybody have. I helped my sister, and she got up in the tree too. We watched you and listened a long time. It was a new life to us. It finished what the woods had begun. We wanted to know you. It seemed to us that nothing could be so wonderful in life as to make friends with you, and we couldn't, of course, even let you see us. That day, when we got back, Ali had discovered, we don't know how, what we were doing, and for the first time in our experience, he was angry, very angry. He shut my sister up in a room and locked the door, and my uncle agreed to it. They said she was to have bread and water for 1 week, and speak to no one. That is when I got angry. Several gasps were heard from the shade of the rose bush, right here, and some murmuring, but Mr. Kirk's quick gesture for silence subdued the excited phase. Pat went on. I made a plan, in my anger at Ali, and wrote it in a note, which I shoved under the door of the room where he had locked my sister. I told her that night I would run away to this place and ask for the job of hired man. It seemed strange that you should do all your own gardening, and you might take me on. I would stay if you did engage me, until my uncle found out where I was. I knew that sooner or later I'd be traced, of course, but if I had only a few hours with the people we had watched from the tree, it would be worth it, and it would give old Ali some bad hours, which he deserved, coming down on my sister like that, when I was more to blame than she was. So I ran away after dark, and nobody followed me or found me. By Saturday afternoon, I was pretty anxious that they hadn't, to tell the truth, because I wanted badly to know how things were going with my sister. I left the work Miss Rosanna had given me and skinned through the woods to scout around Wing Gate, but it came to nothing. I caught no glimpse of my sister at her window. After supper that night I went back again and got in at the cellar window, which was the window my sister and I had made our escapes through, those days of our freedom. But somebody had locked the door at the head of the stairs. I decided to return to Lark's Nest for one night more, and just as I was about to get out, I found our Eliot thrown away on an ash heap down there. Who had done that? Ali or my uncle? My anger boiled up freshly, for that is a book my sister and I have kept always with us, no matter what other books we had to leave behind when we changed homes and countries. I had taken my hired man name, Pat Donovan, from that book. Uncle, when we asked him once, said it had belonged to a servant, who neglected to pack it with his things when he left, and we were welcome to it, so it really did belong to us, since nobody knew what had become of the servant. And now my sister was locked up on bread and water, and they had thrown our very favorite book away. I should like to see that book, Mr. Kirk allowed himself to interrupt, where he would not let the others, an eager light in his eyes. For it was my brother-in-law's, your father's. He was a professor of Greek. Pat looked at Mr. Kirk, as though he thought he was either crazy or lying, but at his sign to continue the narrative he went on. Well, Claire and Rob caught me with the book in the woods, and thought I had stolen it. They had been spying on me when I went into the cellar and came out. That did scare me for my uncle's sake. Perhaps he was right, I thought, and anybody might be a spy. If Claire was a spy, I wasn't having such a good time at Lark's Nest by now as I had hoped, but I decided to stick a while longer. Sunday I didn't have any work to do, and so I got into the woods and watched my sister's window all afternoon. It was the strangest thing that she never came to the window. When the rain began, I got into the cellar. Kokusin came down to get potatoes, and I hid behind one of the furnaces. When he went back to the kitchen, he forgot to lock the door. So I went up into the house. I found my sister's door unlocked, and no sign of her. Ali caught me there and sent me back to Lark's Nest. He said that my sister was safe, and that Monday morning he would come to Lark's Nest and get me. He had known where I was all the time. You see, Ali is not just our teacher, he is our absolute mentor. It is Ali who has brought us up, and we have been taught to give him obedience in everything. So I did what he wanted and came back here, but I was worried almost to death. And that's all. Now, Mr. Kirk, will you please explain why you speak of my sister's being baptized? We are good Muslims, and baptism is not one of our customs. Muslims. Hester held her needle aloft, while her mouth in the shadow of her sunbonnet, took a grim line. But then she remembered. "You believe in God, though," she stated, her shadowed face turning natural again. "And you can still be baptized. It's never too late to mend that." Mr. Kirk himself had not turned a hair at Pat's astounding announcement. He knocked out his pipe, put it into his pocket, and said calmly, "No, you are not Mussulmans. You are my perfectly good Irish-American niece and nephew, Pat and Margaret Donovan. Some day I trust you will thank God for it, but I've got to prove it to you, and it's now nearly 1:15, and my interesting interview, 't'other side of the wall, will be waiting." He turned to the Dryad sharply and added, "But there's one piece of picture remaining to be fitted into Pat's your bit. Margaret, supply us that, and then I'll plunge into my story. How did you come to run away, and on top of that, lose your memory, a carefully brought-up Muslim girl like yourself?" They all looked at the Dryad then. She was sitting erect, her feet concealed under the swirl of her skirt. Her clear face was excessively pale. Claire had never known that eyes could be so deep and still as the eyes of their lost Dryad seemed now. She was like some delicate but strong flower sprung there from the grass. She was like an Iceland poppy. Oh, she is lovely, Claire thought, keenly. But what is she thinking? Does she want Mr. Kirk for her uncle, or believe a word he says? He doesn't have to tease her like that. "I ran away to find Norman, my brother, of course," she responded to Mr. Kirk. Her habit, as Claire had noticed some time ago, was one of docile obedience to whoever commanded her. By Saturday afternoon, I couldn't bear the separation any longer. We had never been apart before, and Ali himself helped me. He came in and let me out of my room, secretly, and told me to go through the woods to Lark's Nest. He said that I was to throw myself on the charity of the people there, and ask them to go on keeping Norman and myself until he should come for us. He wouldn't explain. He just said, "Go and do as I say." So I started off through the woods. I remember it all perfectly, but I lost my way quite soon. I had never been alone out of doors in my life before, and I was too excited, I imagine, to remember about directions. I was wandering around, quite frightened by the silence and the loneliness, when I suddenly saw a spot of vivid orange against the brown of an exposed tree root. I wanted to get close to it and see what could be so bright and sudden there, and I ran toward it. It was then that I tripped over another tree root and pitched forward. I remember, I do, but it was a strange fall I had. It seemed endless. I remember the ground rushing toward my head, and then, when the shock of its striking should have come, there was no shock. It wasn't solid earth I hit, but something soft, like sky or water. I pitched on right through it, into blackness. The next thing that I remember is finding myself walking, and just catching myself from crushing the orange mushroom, quite a distance from the spot where I'd fallen, and there was a wood thrush singing off in the woods somewhere. After that, well, you know it all. She turned her eyes from Mr. Kirk's commanding eyes, and looked at the Fays, especially at Rosanna, with shy gratitude.